All right, good evening and welcome to tonight's Red Barn event. We have a couple chairs here. I know the back is always really, very fun to sit in the back as well. And we do have a couple chairs over there if we need to get some more out too. My name is Dee Butcher and my pronouns are she and her, and I am the Youth Programs Coordinator with the Wenatchee River Institute. With us tonight is Joshua in the back, our Community Programs Manager and also Tech tonight. And we have Lissy doing beverages that you can go up and get some beverages as well. So Joshua is helping make it possible for folks to interact with our events at home and to record it later, watching on our YouTube channel. And so hopefully if after tonight some people didn't see it, you can always go to the YouTube channel. So we'd like to see a show of hands. Is this your first time, anyone attending a WRI program here? If you can raise your hands. All right, welcome. We're so glad that you're here today. Thank you for coming. So just a little bit about us. We are a nonprofit with a mission to connect people, communities, and the natural world. Wenatchee River Institute works towards our mission throughout the youth programs that deliver hands-on curriculum to the Wenatchee Valley and along the Columbia. So today, an educator and I were at Brewster, and two other youth programs educators were in Quincy delivering youth programs. Our community programs reach people through our Red Barn events like this one, our seasonal walks, like we have snowshoe walks going on right now. This is our last one this weekend, however, because as you know, the snow is diminishing. Workshops in the community garden. Another aspect of WRI is our effort to connect Indigenous peoples to their ancestral lands here. I would like to take time for our land acknowledgement. And you'll see a map up here. This land acknowledgement was created alongside the Shimpish-Squashu people. We are spreading the message they wish to be spread to the public. The land Wenatchee River Institute sits on is the ancestral homelands of the Shimpish-Squashu, Piscosa, or Wenatchee people. The Shimpish-Squashu, meaning people in between, had villages positioned along the Wenatchee River and the surrounding areas. Their ancestral homeland extends from the Cascade Ridge throughout what is now known as Wenatchee and Okanagan valleys. The culture and economy of the Shimpish-Squashu people centers on taking care of the land. They fish, hunt, gather roots and berries, basket-making materials, and medicines. The Shimpish-Squashu are named within the Yakima Treaty of 1855. Language to establish the Wenatchee Reservation was never followed through, even with the needed surveying completed. Many Shimpish-Squashu now live on the Colville Reservation, 150 miles northeast of Leavenworth. They were forced off their land here, and the U.S. government moved them to the reservation. The Shimpish-Squashu people are still alive today. They continue to practice their culture, harvest their traditional foods and medicines, and hold their ceremonies passed down from their ancestors. Most people won't see or notice them, but they continue to be on the land they are connected to. Their traditional language is Inhamchin, an interior Salish dialect, and we'd like to welcome you all by saying hello in their language, Tilusht. We offer this land acknowledgement as the first step to amplifying Indigenous voices and recognizing the harm done to them as a people. We stand as an ally to recognize their connection to the land and their rights to practice their culture on these sacred lands. We encourage all to learn about the Indigenous peoples of the place you now call home. The Wenatchee River Institute is committed to sharing this land acknowledgement and following up with other actions to educate and be respectful. So thank you for listening to that. We'd also like to thank our sponsors for tonight. The Red Barn events would not be possible without the support from local business and organizations such as these. So we would like to thank, as you can see, we have many sponsors. So we're going to thank our major ones on here, or you would be here for a lot longer. So the NCW Audubon Society, Sleeping Lady Mountain Resort, Ludwig's German Restaurant, Leavenworth KOA, Obertal Inn, Ryan House, South Restaurants, Leavenworth Outdoor Center, Orion River Rafting, Icicle Brewing Company, Munchin House, Leavenworth Chamber of Commerce, and Syndicate Smith. We thank our sponsors, but we also rely on our community to keep our programs continuing and growing. If you feel moved to donate and support our mission, you can do so after the event at the welcome table over there. You may have seen the QR code in the slideshow. As part of our strategic plan, we are actively looking for feedback from you all. I will bring back the slide at the end if you'd like to leave any thoughts or ideas for us. And now I'm going to introduce Joan with the Native Plant Society, who's going to talk about the Native Plant Society and then introduce our speaker.
Okay, hello. So I'm filling a couple of roles tonight. The chair of our chapter, Ted Alway, is off in Southern California somewhere, and our program chair just would prefer that I do the introduction tonight. So here I am. I'm also on the board. I'm the immediate past chair. So a little bit about the Native Plant Society. How many people here belong to the Native Plant Society? Ooh, nice. Okay. So if you have heard about the Native Plant Society and you're interested in more information, I would encourage you to put your name on the clipboard over there that at the top it says Washington Native Plant Society. And you will automatically, if you put your email on there, you will get all of our informative emails announcing our programs and our field trips. We're about ready to launch into the spring field trip season. And so you'll see a lot of really fun stuff you can do out there in the mountains, chasing plants around with fellow plant nerds. So a couple of announcements from the chapter. We have another program here on March 18th about native pollinators, and then another program back in Wenatchee at the museum on April 3rd, and that will be about our really cool snowball or hedgehog cactus. It's got several, also called basalt cactus. Anyway, a bunch of common names. And then on March 26th, we're going to get together for our annual social, also an important fundraiser for us at the Confluence Technology Center in Wenatchee. So I would encourage you to come and meet more fellow native plant enthusiasts. So without further ado, I will introduce our speaker tonight, who has drawn quite the large crowd. I don't know that I have ever seen. So Nate taught me how to say his last name. I'm going to practice it right now. Nate Hufsna. Yeah, Hufsna. Okay, there we go. Okay, right. Okay, anyway, he's a Leavenworth, Washington-based wetland and riparian ecologist. He researches and restores aquatic ecosystems across the Pacific Northwest. Has a PhD in ecology from Utah State University's Watershed Sciences Department. He's an environmental storyteller at heart, and I can attest to that because I heard him give a presentation at Holden Village last weekend on Lake Chelan. Nate currently spins environmental narratives of the Wenatchee and Entiat watersheds, Lake Chelan, and Washington's Aleutian Peninsula. Nate currently works with the Lake Chelan Research Institute as a senior scientist and conducts environmental research and policy work through his firm, Meadow Run Environmental. Recently, Nate has focused his attention on environmental flows for rivers and streams and how they affect various forest habitats. So without further ado, I will turn it over to the main attractant, Nate.
Thank you. Appreciate it. So thanks everybody for being here on a Spring Lake Thursday night. I'm impressed. I'm actually kind of overwhelmed by how many folks are on board. Thanks so much to the Washington Native Plant Society, WRI, for being our host. This is actually a co-presentation with the Society of Wetland Scientists, including the Pacific Northwest chapter. We're kind of a parallel universe to the Native Plant Society, but a lot of us integrate, and so happy to bring that online. We should have some folks from SWS all across the state. And so I'm gonna just jump right into it. And by jump right into it, I mean 5 introductory slides before I jump into it. And so tonight, I would like everybody, as we're working through these introductory slides, make sure that you get a postcard for our first little interactive bit that's gonna be 3 slides from now. So if you haven't seen those passed around, they should be making the rounds. We can get you one. These postcards, as well as the slides that I have and the photos within them, were taken either by myself or by the wonderful Stephen Nam. Handsome and charming as always, bald, so always wearing a hat right there in the yellow. But yeah, so if you see a really nice image, it's probably his, and a really average one, it's probably mine. And so what we're gonna use those images to do are really answer 2 questions. What can Cottonwood tell us about rivers? And the second one, what can Cottonwood teach us about ourselves? And so to do that, there's some pencils kind of floating around. Josh has got a whole bin of them if you want it. I want you to take a little reflection. We're going to look backward and internally before we look forward, right? So I'd like you to think of a time when you're under an overwhelming stress, following some sort of disturbance. And just think about what that was. Just take 30 seconds. I don't want like I burned my toast or I was late for work. I want you to think about like the hard stuff. You know, a cancer diagnosis, losing a relationship, a friend, a job, something that was big and scary. And then I want you to take that pencil and that note card, and I want you to write down an adjective, a descriptive word, or a verb, something that you did to show resilience in that situation. And you can write a couple. What traits did you exhibit under duress, under stress? Go ahead, write them down. You have an assignment, come on. So we'll take about 30 seconds. You can make a big list or a short list. And when you get done with that, I'd like you to turn to your neighbor and kind of think about what those traits are that show human resilience in the face of adversity. So the chatter can just start whenever. Don't be shy. Or else I'll call on you. All right. So we're already at a quarter past, so we're gonna pause. We're gonna take a quick pause on that. I want you to hold that reflection quite literally. You've written it down now. We're gonna come back to that once we've learned a little bit about Cottonwood, and you'll see exactly why. So hold that thought. So this evening, we're gonna talk about the humble cottonwood. I use cottonwood as plural, multiple species. We're gonna talk about specifically one, western black cottonwood. We'll talk about what it means to be a cottonwood, where you live fast, you die young. Your life is in the floodplain. Life cycle requirements it takes to exist in that environment, as well as where and why cottonwood grow, and why they don't grow in some places. We'll also get into what exactly they tell us about river environments and the watersheds above them. And finally, we'll revisit that card you just took, and we'll ask ourselves, what can we learn from the humble cottonwood? And so, like I said, 5 introductory slides. I apologize, but this is going to make it less painful for everybody. We're going to start off with a couple definitions so we don't jump into jargon. The first one, riparian. Who knows that word? Do you?
No.
No? Okay. And what's your name?
Iris.
Can somebody help explain it to Iris? What does it mean to be riparian?
Near a river.
Near a river. Simply, life in the floodplain, life on the fast lane, right? So you're just next to flowing water, streams and rivers. Ecologically, disturbance, we're not going to make anybody have to get into that one. Basically, we're talking about biomass removing disturbances, things that take away plants on the landscape, things like fire, like grazing, flooding that breaks them off and washes them downstream. And then there's stress. This is an analog to that flooding disturbance. Turns out that much like we don't like to be underwater for extreme amounts of time, most plants don't either. And so we're going to talk about flooding stress. I may call it anoxia, hypoxia, lack of oxygen, basic stuff. And then we'll talk about the traits that it takes to persist through disturbance and persist through stress. And so those traits are just evolved strategies that express in a given species to live in an environment. And that's what makes cottonwood special. They're specifically adapted to their environment based on those traits. And so now we've cleared up that jargon. I want to let you know that if you have any questions, do not be shy. Feel free to interrupt me, okay? Any questions? Yes, ma'am. I take all questions.
Is a cottonwood a specific tree, or are there different types of cottonwood?
Oh, we're going to get there. I did not plant that. So what are cottonwood and why are they important? It's not a silly question. It's like you're setting me up here. So in their most basic form, the Populus species are the cottonwoods. They're trees in the willow family, Salicaceae. They complete their life cycle largely on a floodplain. We take for granted that we live in a wet place, even on the east side, so we see cottonwood making a living in places that are not necessarily a floodplain, but if you think to the desert southwest or you think to boreal Canada, most of your cottonwoods, your populous species, are going to be on a floodplain next to a river. They establish after and they persist through floods after they've established. They're resilient to disturbance and stress, hence our little activity, right? And they have a unique ecological role. The jargon would be niche there. And so, to your question, ma'am, there are 5 major species of populus in North America. We'll work our way from left to right, west to east. We're going to talk mostly about Populus trichocarpa, the western black cottonwood. Some people will call it Populus balsamifera, subspecies trichocarpa. We'll just go with Populus trichocarpa, or when I say cottonwood, I'm generally referring to black cottonwood tonight. In the desert southwest, we see Populus fremontii, the Fremont cottonwood. If you note the pattern of that distribution map, what do we see there? Where do we see those cottonwood? What are they toward? They're on the rivers. So they basically trace the hydrologic map. When we get into Populus angustifolia, that's a more montane species. We see those in higher areas, but also along floodplains and rivers. Populus deltoides, the plains cottonwood, is more ubiquitous in kind of forest edges, disturbed areas from the Missouri River east. And then Populus balsamifera, way up north, Alaska, Canada, boreal zones, widespread, mixes with aspen. But generally, these all have similar functional niches in their environment. And so don't take it from me. I brought along some friends. We've got some friends online. I've got some friends up here. And so we're going to hear from some experts, all of whom are actually mostly government employees. These are the hardworking conservation stewards that make the environmental policies we have in this country work. And so I'm proud to bring to you this video with some of my friends from the federal and state services.
Cottonwoods are tall trees with
Josh?
canopies that like wet places. So they often grow along rivers and sometimes they'll grow in springs.
Cottonwood are many species in the genus Populus, and they are critical to the physical framework and biological ecosystems along rivers and floodplains worldwide.
Cottonwood are among the largest hardwoods in our region. A member of the willow family, these giant beauties live fast and die young.
Black cottonwood, Populus balsamifera. It's one of the few tree species that will grow in wetlands in Washington to provide a forest canopy.
Cottonwoods are a foundation species.
They create physical structure along rivers and floodplains. So they trap sediment, they create roughness, they're part of the foundation of stable geomorphic surfaces.
Cottonwood are important species because they provide exceptionally rich habitat for a diverse array of wildlife species.
All the while providing an invaluable habitat resource and facilitating the processes that form and maintain the structure and function of our riparian and riverine ecosystems.
Our cottonwoods can control the plants and animals that also occur along that river system. So the presence and absence of cottonwoods can actually completely change how a river system looks.
Also, they're critical to the biological components. So they provide habitat for wildlife and plants of all shapes and sizes.
Why are cottonwoods important? Their beauty, the cohesive root structure, the carbon, the shade, the food for fish, but mostly the smell.
And the resin on the leaf buds smells like perfume. It's one of my favorite smells in the world.
I'm very, very pleased to have gotten their collaboration for this talk. All right. So a couple themes probably emerge from that video, right? First and foremost, they're a pioneer species, cottonwoods. They show up after disturbance, generally a flood, as we've established. They're also a foundation species, or foundational species, depending on how you want to call it, which means they both rely on and they alter hydrogeomorphic processes. So hydro or hydrological, water-based processes, geomorphic, basically mean the movement of sediment. And so effectively, this movement with water, this movement with sediment, it gives birth to cottonwoods, it takes them away, and they provide habitat throughout their life cycle, both in the stream, in the middle, when vertical on the bank, when horizontal on the bank. Generally speaking, we'll hear things like large wood, shade, structure. They all mean effectively habitat metrics. And they contribute to food webs, right? Leaves fall off, they provide nutrients, those nutrients make it into a stream. That's the basis for what fish eat. And they're also a full sensory experience, as both Bill and Patty told us about. I should also note that anybody who's been to the beach down here knows that Cottonwood midsummer provide the perfect size stick for your dog, and we can't take that for granted. Bill nailed it. These are really spectacular, they're not creatures, they're plants, right? So these are really spectacular organisms that live their entire life in one place, as all trees and most plants generally do. And I think we can appreciate a couple things about them, not the least of which is their beauty, but I think there's something slightly poetic, maybe even, dare I say, utilitarian as well. You know, I see this picture from Stephen compared to my work ones, and I think spiritual. I mean, these are fantastic trees in fantastic locations that show us not only where we are, but what the processes are above us. What's going on in the watershed? What's happening with the floodplain above us? And people try to capture this beauty, and it's hard to. Stephen, where was this photo taken?
It's on the Flat River, right on the border of British Columbia and Montana.
So we could be in Trichocarpa country, we could be in Balsamifera country. This is really, I think this is a fantastic example. People go to paint, they go to document, they go to be a part of the forest and document it. I personally, on my better days or my worst days, find that Cottonwood are a funny joke. Sorry, this one's gonna be at Jason's expense. How long does it take for this fish to get this big?
4 years.
4 years, okay. What species is it, Jason? Chinook, all right, so it's a 4-year-old Chinook, it's about 3 feet long. I don't wanna brag, guys, but I got this Cottonwood. It took about 6 weeks to get 3 feet long. I'm just saying, I didn't have to go to the ocean or nothing. So, I like to think that they're a good tool for humor and bridging the gap between my fishy friends and us plant people. And the takeaway here is that the Cottonwood species, with their obligate riparian traits and a life cycle adapted to natural flow and sediment regimes, they are the riparian tree species. And we're going to kind of break this down with a hydrology, geology, biology stool that shows that you take one of those legs away, the stool falls apart. So Cottonwood would be the biology, the movement of water would be that hydrology, and then the sediment that water moves, that's the geology or geomorphology. But that's what it takes to grow a cottonwood forest. So, what do Cottonwood need to establish to go from this flood on the left to this floodplain early generational forest on the right? Well, first and foremost, you need a seed source. That's generally in the form of mature trees somewhere nearby. You need a bare, moist landform, and that's best created from a flood. So you need a flood regime, which is the timing, the magnitude of floods over many, many years. You need to have that flooding be periodic to regular. It doesn't need to be big all the time where it scours out the entire floodplain and moves away the whole ecosystem downstream, puts it in the Columbia, puts it in the ocean. But if it's too small, trees like Doug fir, trees like hemlock, ponderosa pine come in, they start to lock up those landforms. It's hard to get that open space back. And so you need the right size flood and the right size base flow just meaning that low summer flow and the recession between the flood and the low flow. And you need a natural sediment regime because erosion and deposition create those landforms. So if you take away that substrate, effectively, you can take away cottonwood too. The stool falls down.
Does the landform need to be sandy?
Doesn't have to be. Generally, if it's wet and has an open light environment, we do okay. And the reason for that is because there are traits that cottonwood have. What's the dominant trait you think of in the spring when we talk about cottonwood? Just somebody shout it out. Mushrooms? Okay, all right, this guy, we got a joker. All right, so Trichocarpa literally comes from Latin, thrix, hair, carp, meaning fruit. So we're talking about a hair fruit. So you have seen these seeds blow through our neighborhood, the smell that was alluded to, that balsamic sort of smell, and it's in quantity. And so to be a sandy substrate, to germinate, you don't necessarily need that. I'm sure some could germinate in that sidewalk crack with the right irrigation regime. It's an open light environment, pretty good to go. So you have that seed quantity, it's a massive amount. The dispersal, that timing of it, it coincides with the rivers. That's called hydrochory, when the water dispersed seeds are basically happening at the same time as the flood and the drawdown that follows it. There's rapid root growth, that's another trait. Flexible stems, basically when that flood comes through, the next one, when it hits 90 degrees after it's germinated, it just bends, it doesn't break. If it does break, it can resprout. Anoxia tolerance, that's that flood tolerance I was referring to. It doesn't slow them down. They can persist for quite a while. And then adventitious roots, that's what you see in the pink there on the right, and then the other roots on the top. When exposed to flooding, they just adapt. Not evolutionarily, they acclimate in real time. They put out new roots, they seek out that oxygen, they seek out those nutrients, and they get back to living. So this is where you're like, oh, graphs on a Thursday. I got a couple, I'm not gonna lie. So let's take a look at this point bar on the left. If you drop down here, what we see is basically the planform view. And so we have an outside bend, this is the steep part, and then we have the inside bend, that's the point bar. And what we see in the top here is basically those mature trees are dropping their seed into the area that is laterally migrating toward the outside bend. And so effectively, you take sediment from the outside bend, you put it on the inside bend, the mature trees move further from that inside bend over time, and effectively, they propagate new cohorts over time. And so what does that look like? Here's an example from the Stillaguamish. Anybody ever spend time in Snohomish County on the Stilly? It's a wonderful river. It is not glacially fed. It's particularly susceptible to climate change, problematically enough. But because of that, they actually can get really big floods that come up based on strictly rain events and their watershed hydrology being tied to logging. So on the left here, we have the active floodplain out of sight. There's water there. The inactive floodplain on the right. So you're lower on the left, you're higher on the right. And as you go up, the probability that you're flooded goes down. The flood it takes to get up there is going to be bigger and less frequent over time. And so what does that mean? In that heavily flooded area, you're basically going to see the sediment reworked commonly. You're going to see seedlings colonize on that edge. They may get washed away in the next flood in the next year. And it's more or less a seed sink zone. That's where the seeds end up, whether they turn into trees or not. And on that high area, we have less frequent flooding. That sediment gets reworked very infrequently. The trees are able to mature, and it becomes a seed source zone that feeds back into our example here. And now, we'll go ahead and we'll look at a little lateral migration. And so what I want you to note is we're going to play a game with USGS hydrographs. Is everybody familiar with these, or should I explain them? Explain them. That's what I'm here for. So all of these are going to be time on the horizontal axis, and they're going to be discharge on the vertical axis. Discharge is just a way of saying stream flow, how much water is moving through the system. What I want you to note, too, is that these are logarithmic scale, not linear. And so at the top, we've got 60,000 cubic feet per second. At the bottom, 100. So these are orders of magnitude different. And in this particular example, we're going to focus on two locations in 3 different years. In the top left, 1990, we see some point bars, an island forming. They're minimally vegetated coming out of the last flood. We go to 2011, we actually get a pretty good flood. You see that up on the USGS gauge at 60,000 feet. The next closest one was 2 years prior, and it was also about 60,000 feet. So we've got plenty of sediment to rework in the system. We see the river moving out toward the farm field here, moving to the right. We see that point bar being stabilized and colonized by vegetation. Josh, do I have a pointer here or not really? I can narrate, don't worry about it. So effectively, we see those little green guys in 2011. By 2022, those have become saplings, and they further locked in that landform. On the bottom example, we see more mature cottonwoods. That's that seed source. And effectively, those have more or less locked the entire floodplain in place there, except for the downstream edge. But where we see accretion, where we see getting above the flood, we see green showing up. Those are more cottonwood seedlings of a younger generation. Do I have any questions thus far? All right. Anybody from the Entiat? I don't get to say I'm sorry, but I digress. It's probably the worst restaurant town in all of Chelan County, let the record show. If you can name a restaurant there, let me know after this. So this is an example of the floodplain, and what I want you to look at here is the time slider first. It's going to come back around. Who's been here a while? Raise your hand if you've been here since 1994. What happened in 94? Fires. Now watch that color change. Bam. Green to pink. That is when we went from Doug fir, ponderosa pine forest, Engelmann spruce, to effectively the scorched earth, open landscape we see in the central Entiat today. And so why am I showing you this transition to the fire, right? We have an abundant sediment supply. We have a new light environment. We didn't burn the floodplain, but we burned the outer edges. So we now have pretty prime, open cottonwood habitat in floodplains. We see some migration of this channel over that time, but really it's going to be water moving within that sort of dark stripe. So we have great recipe to make cottonwood here. We've got a laterally unconfined floodplain. That means the river has room to move across the valley bottom. There's a natural flood regime. There's no dam above this location. The magnitude and the timing of floods are going to coincide with seed dispersal and set, make new cohorts of cottonwood. There's also a natural sediment regime effect here, right? All that stuff that burned contributed sediment, which goes down into the Entiat pool, kind of problematic if you're a dam operator, but really good for creating point bars, islands, braided areas, et cetera. And so those diverse floodplain landforms, as terraces, bars, and islands, are effectively the perfect habitat. We'll also note that looking at this hydrograph, what we see here is a diversity of flows between the high and the low, between about 5,000 CFS and 100 CFS. But we've got good diversity. What I want you to notice is the second to the right is 2023. Then we're going to go see what that flood looked like. And Josh, we're going to have a little sound here. So this is basically May 2023, and what we're looking at is the Entiat River Road, and we're seeing a newly constructed side channel that is receiving its first major flood test. And so that hydrograph I just showed, effectively, there had never been a flood as high as the 2023 in this constructed area. So what we're seeing is these mature cottonwood here, getting ready to rain seed, leaves are out, buds are...
When this flood recedes, we'll take all those fine sediments and really start to do some work with it. Note that the horizontal wood on the ground across this site is really providing a lot of roughness, and I expect to see some wider outside bends as well as just widespread erosion and deposition across the site in ways that we haven't historically seen. For context, I'm about a foot above the road right now, and this water is probably going to crest about 5 p.m. today, peak heat. Maybe a little bit sooner. Hopefully a thunderstorm doesn't roll through, but I would anticipate that all of these surfaces, if not fully inundated, at least have groundwater really, really going hard today.
We have here our flood. What else do we have? We've got our bare sand. We've got our open canopy, that light environment, wide open. We've got mature trees, which means we've got seeds. Hey, following August, we're in business. The flood has delivered, and the abundance is ours. So this is that same landform that was in the foreground right here. You can tell the wood in the background is actually also in the video. And so if you jump out to the main stem, this is the same hydrograph, right? And so we're between, like I said, about 10 and 5,000 CFS. We're going between 1994 and 2024. Generally speaking, there were 2 big floods in the last decade. And so on the left side here, we're high and dry. Our trees can get big, they can persist, they don't get broken, they don't get flooded. It's the inactive floodplain, relatively speaking, as we get an increase in elevation. Then on the active channel, we have those small frequent floods. So this is our active floodplain more commonly. And we see this wonderful stripe of new cottonwood that came off that 2023 flood. This was a photo I took this last fall.
Nate, is there like a maximum distance they live away from rivers?
A maximum distance?
Is it elevation or like distance from so the roots can't get to the water?
It's an interesting question. These are adaptable, resilient species that they kind of just find a way, and so they can grow in all sorts of bizarre places, and I'm happy to talk about those exceptions to the rule. But generally speaking, most of them are going to be areas that the river has carved out an open environment with a nice sediment regime where you get some sort of sand, some sort of silt, a little bit of gravel maybe, cobbles are fine. But as long as you have that drawdown of the flood where they can grow to track the flood, the lateral distance maybe doesn't matter. And if there's groundwater or a wetland with an open area, they love the edges of those too. So, thanks, Tippa. So another example is I'm going to take y'all to the Sanpoil River up on the Culver Reservation. This is a series of 6 photos going from 2003 to 2016. And we've got a pretty standard ho-hum floodplain here. You can kind of see it, but what I want you to note here is in 2016, we go from a meandering channel, big flood in April, to post-flood recovery. And what happened there was the big fire in 2014. Turns out that fires, this arrow on the left, shows 2014, generally coincide with bad water years. So we had a low water year that was followed by a fire. This 2013 pre-fire photo shows the same reach as the two photos in the bottom. And what I want you to notice is you see that white, those are the sandbars, the green, generally cottonwood and willow forest, and then the 2016 April photo I've annotated in what I find to be a flamboyant, sparkly color that I really like, is the full flood discharge. So the wetted width goes from this little stripe here to this big old gully washer, which created wetlands, it created side channels. It was just a really big natural event. You can't see it out of sight. With those last photos, there's a road crossing that more or less fire hoses sediment and water through there. And it's a very, very high energy area, which is actually amazing. There's bedrock hanging out, to Tifa's question, by that road. So there's not really any habitat on the outside. It's all the way against the valley margin. The floodplain ends there. And so that 2017 flood was one of the bigger ones on record. It was about 6,000 CFS. It was followed by another good flood in 2018. And so what does that look like now? As of last September, we see both the decadent, mature cottonwood that are getting old. We see some snags, which is just a fancy word for dead trees. We also had a bunch of establishment, and unfortunately, neither of these photos are from this specific reach, but there are cottonwood seedlings everywhere, saplings that date back to those floods. This is a really pretty picture that Stephen took, and I'm going to use that to ask for any questions you might have. Yes?
Where can we buy the perfume?
The perfume? Man, that's a marketing opportunity I hadn't considered. I'll get back to you. It'll smell like this shirt.
Go to Enchanted Park and just like rub some buzz and put your finger in alcohol and you got your perfume.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The problem is that the cottonwood also stains. I've got so many shirts that just have the big yellow like boogers look from, anyway, I digress. And so we took this break because now we're gonna go to graphs on a Thursday night. So what we have going on here, this horizontal axis, once again, is time. This vertical axis is the elevation above, it's basically the stage at base flow. So how high are you relative to that low water? The left graph is in centimeters, the right graph is in meters. What you want to take away from this is that in the bottom left, there's a flood. Peaks in June, maybe July. The recession of that flood corresponds to the natural seed rains of cottonwood and sandbar willow, Salix exigua. So those roots, they have a survivable stage decline of 2.5 centimeters per day or 1 centimeter per day. So when you time that up, effectively what you see are the recruitment bands, they call them, and those are the bands in time for both of those species. This is known as the recruitment box. Stuart Root, he's a very fine and short Canadian, coined the term in the 90s. But effectively, the recruitment box is that hydrologic drawdown that allows the seeds to hit the sand at just the right time. The roots can track it. If the water recedes too quickly, no cohort that year. If it goes too slowly, maybe they also don't make it because they're flooded out. Generally speaking, some of them will survive, those that are slightly higher in a wet year, slightly lower in a dry year. And it gives you these amazing landforms like the one we see here. Anybody know where this is? Does anybody like really average pizza in Chelan County? It's a restaurant that is on Lake Wenatchee Highway that I will not name. Shh. We're going to get sued here, man. The place is for sale. Anyway, yeah, it is Lake Wenatchee Highway, right where Nason Creek comes into the Wenatchee River below the lake. And they have that same layering, which pops so cleanly when you look at the fall colors. So we talked about what it takes to be a cottonwood, how they can make it through floods, fires, all these stressors and disturbances. But why don't cottonwoods show up in some locations? Generally speaking, it's the inverse of the same reasons they do show up. We see a loss or alteration of the seed source. Maybe there aren't mature trees in the floodplain. Maybe the flood regime is too wet or dry, comes too early or late. Maybe that drawdown just isn't right and the sediment size corresponds to it as well. So you don't have the right size sediment to work with the right size flood. Then there's floodplain connectivity. If you keep a dry landform for a really long time, non-disturbance specialists like Doug fir, like hemlock, grand fir, they make their way in, and these inactive landforms more or less get locked up and stabilized by upland trees. You can also have things like grazing and fire that roll through, and I think we're going to see plenty of examples of that over time. So, anybody from Yakima? Anybody ever live in Yakima? I'm sorry joke is out again. Well, I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm glad you made it out. You're a survivor, I can tell. All right. So, the Yakima River, does anybody know when you drive over I-90 and you look at Cochise, Clay Elm, Lake Easton, the whole Coachella system, what is that? I know Jason knows, but what are those reservoirs for? Irrigation, right? And so that was put in by the Bureau of Reclamation as part of the Yakima Basin Plan. And if you look closely at this top left example, we're talking about the flood regime from basically 1908 to 1914 before the dam. Look at the Julian day. That is just the number of days. So we're talking like the 150th day. So we're more or less in like May, April at that point. That's when they used to have the high flows on the Clay Elm, Union Gap, and Wapato USGS stations. Q is just the shorthand for discharge. That's just the amount of water moving through the system. We got time on the horizontal again. And also note there's that pulse when you see snow events or you see rain on snow events in the lowlands. There's a secondary flood that happens in December. It's also reasonably big enough to create bare landforms that are wet, cottonwood habitat. The seed will come back later. After you put that dam in, however, the magnitude of those goes way down. So we're talking about 400 cubic meters per second down to a peak flood that is A, at the wrong time. We're talking in the winter, January, when they're letting out flood flows from rain on snow at Snoqualmie Pass. And then we're peaking at exactly the wrong time for cottonwood because we have to let water go out for irrigation. It's not a bad thing. It's not a qualitative thing. It's just a thing that changes the character of the river, its ability to support these forests. So if you look at the establishment year, this is a tree count of new recruits. And after 1980, basically goes silent. We see that peak flow get reduced. We see sort of more peak flows at the wrong time. It doesn't really show it on the top graph, but we're not putting that water in the ecosystem at the time that corresponds to cottonwood life cycle.
So there's zero recruitment after that?
In this particular study at the locations, yes.
That's crazy.
It's a big concern because it turns out Yakima's a hot place. You don't have forest all the way out in the floodplain that are just going to add Doug fir or add ponderosa pine. You have sagebrush. So this is that foundational species, and when you lose it, you're kind of hosed if you want structure in your floodplain and riparian zone. I've got a couple other great examples. This is the Columbia River below Grand Coulee Dam, so just downstream of our Sanpoil example. This is the San Joaquin River in Central California below Friant Dam near Fresno. Anybody ever been to either of these places? What's the climate like in Fresno in the summer?
It's really hot.
It's really hot. Anybody want to move there?
They have a climbing gym.
Fair enough. Tifa's got the beta. Talk to her after this. And then anybody's been to Coulee City, Electric City? It's really, really hot, really low. It is just blister in place. So effectively, the only place cottonwood can grow are on these rivers. And so if we're looking at another USGS hydrograph, in this particular example, it's the San Joaquin. Notice that variability on the high end and the low end. And then effectively, what we're seeing toward the end is those drought years where they have to return water via aqueducts to irrigators. We're going from 20,000 CFS in a decent year down to just above 10. That's not a lot of water. And so if you look back at that photo, that thing is basically a flume that has wetlands on the edges. It has the same flow all the time until they're pumping the water out for agricultural purposes in the Central Valley. And I want to be clear, it's not a qualitatively bad thing. It's just a trade-off we've made as a society to have our rivers work for us in different ways. It's not a way that cottonwood can grow, though. This is just below Coulee City, below Grand Coulee Dam. And then this graph is a little bit different. This is the annual peak stream flow. Notice that in 1904, we're talking about floods of 700,000 cubic feet per second. It's kind of unfathomable. That would be a big bump in Columbia River biblical flood. The dam goes in roughly here, and then construction starts, dispersion works its way through. We get a couple big floods that push through the system, but largely because we manage our hydro system, where one dam coordinates the water that makes it down to the next dam, including ours in the Entiat Pool and Rock Island Pool. We basically have constricted this range. We're not seeing 700,000 CFS anymore. We're seeing 400, maybe 100,000 in a bad year because we're moving that water for other purposes. Carbon-free power. It's not good. It's not bad. It's just the trade-off we've chose to make. It's not a trade-off that's fully compatible with floodplain forest, however. So what are Cottonwood telling us about rivers? They're telling us, number one, if we have healthy flood and sediment regimes. They're also telling us when and where our rivers have room to work and the substrate they need to work with. They're also telling us when flooding disturbance last built forest and perhaps even the landforms that they reside on. They're effectively showing us the stool on the floodplain. Let's pull those cards back out. Come on, I know you wrote something. So everybody thought at that time they were under stress or duress, that disturbance in the floodplain of life. And then I asked you to talk about how you showed resilience in that situation. What traits did you exhibit? And I could make you shout them out, but I'm just going to, wrap this up so we have a little time for questions. But just look at what you wrote, and then I'll give you some examples of what you might have written, pardon me. And so these are all Stephen Nam photos. They're really good. So perhaps you talked about persistence or flexibility, bending or not breaking. Perhaps you and your family, your colleagues, your friends, your skiing and climbing partners, you thought about how to work together to get out of that tough situation. Much as Cottonwood worked together with sediment regimes, floods. Maybe you had to get creative. You had to come up with a strategy just to make it through the day, the year, season. I think these bears are pretty creative. They took a dead cottonwood and they made a den. And as soon as I'm done, Stephen's going to tell us the story behind this photo because I really want to hear it. I also think that trees in general, especially ones that live for a long time in places that have a lot of disturbance, can teach us a sense of history. What got them there, what they've seen. Sense of history and a sense of place. And I think that we can also learn from Cottonwood because that sense of place is not just a given floodplain, landform, but these Cottonwood make these places better, right? So as we identify with a place, we too can make it better and interact with the processes that make it a community, home. Lastly, I think you could argue Cottonwood will teach us resilience. I think the last several weeks have given a lot of people a lot of needs for some of those tools in the toolkit to show resilience. And I hope that Cottonwood provide a metaphor so you can take that postcard, have a look at it, be strong and tall, maybe not 150 feet tall, but like a cottonwood, get through the floods of life. Thank you. And we do have some time for questions, I believe. Mr. Schilling.
So in all your illustrious research travels, work in cottonwood ecosystems, what stands out to you or what do you remember as like the quintessential, or at least in your mind, the most magnificent grove of cottonwoods that you'll never forget?
Oh man, that's, whew. I would say the Entiat's a pretty special place in the fall. If y'all have ever been up there near the gate, the Entiat is not a regulated river. It has a couple rapids, but it gives way to this kind of narrow run riffle system. And honestly, I just spent so much time there that I can't help but find them compelling. But also in Boreal Alaska, where you see the difference between the birch and the cottonwood in fall and the aspen, they have subtly different colors and timing. And that's not like a specific tree, but that sheer overwhelming numbers game of the foliage compared to, in that case, black spruce, white spruce, things like that. And then in the Grand Canyon, you see these legacy trees that are really, really old, right? And I could give you a whole talk just about the Grand Canyon. But effectively, the dam above the Colorado River through the national park in the Grand Canyon has basically entrenched the river. It's incised, and so you have shrubbery that catches sediment. And every time they do push an environmental flow, that sediment gets trapped in arrowweed and willow and tamarisk and things like that. So the river gets lower and lower relative to those landforms and locked up. So the few cottonwood that are there are really old, and they either predate the dam or they're next to springs that just gave them a lucky leg up, but they're really not tied to the floodplain anymore. So the ones that are there are pretty special because they're in just the perfect place.
So what is really old for cottonwood?
What is really old? Centennial trees would be really old, yeah. I mean, a lot of them fall over before that. I would say 50, 60, 70 years on the west side in Olympic Peninsula, Puget Sound, because it turns out they need a light environment, and you shade them out with really big Doug fir or hemlock, they don't really have much of a chance. So Lundgren.
Nate, do we have any idea along the main stem Columbia, the cottonwood galleries, like, does anybody look to see pre-dam, like in any of the reaches, like above Rock Island or Rocky Reach or Wells, what cottonwood galleries would have looked like, how persistent they were?
So my lovely wife's family is from the Entiat Ardentvoir area, and they have stories about going down to pitch a couple innings with rocks at the houses at the old town of Entiat when it was on the Columbia River before it was flooded. And when there were meanders and bends, apparently that example we showed in the figure where you see those really distinct Still-Squamish River outside bends and those point bars, they weren't that big and, meandering, sinuous, but they did have features like that where you had a variety of substrate, and there were forests, and there were fishing camps and things that were tied to those forests. There were generally folks who were now up on the Colville Reservation. But yeah, we did have those. We didn't really document it. We just kind of got on with the show in the time that we built those dams.
Do a postmortem with bathymetry and understand what might have existed based on water levels in the pools, pre-dam?
That's an interesting prospect. Yeah, you probably could. You probably could just say like, hey, here's a height above a given stage, but at this point it's water through the dam, right? We're not going to get it back. So, and I also think the research environment isn't such that we're going to get a lot of public funding to take on such things. We'd be more likely to see folks kind of doing things like in the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act. That's basically all the federal dams when they get licensed. They get everybody in the room to trade horses and make endangered species and habitat sort of restoration priorities. And so I sat on one of those committees and we basically said, the best you're gonna get is you need to focus on finding your tributary junctions where the Yakima comes into the Columbia, where the Methow comes into the Columbia, and basically find those areas right before it becomes a still pool and try to catch that window of the right flood at the right time with a little bit of sediment so you can build cottonwood on landforms. Jonah Manning.
Nate, how much can we take from what you've taught us about cottonwoods tonight and apply it to other riparian species like willows or dogwoods, or is any of it generalizable to other species that are living in the same environment?
Yeah, the establishment in particular, right? And so there are other plants, to Jonah's point, red osier dogwood or salix, the willows that are in the same family. They can establish after a flood. The difference is they don't get to be 150 feet tall. And so the fact is the structural integrity of that floodplain is really tied to the size of the tree. And you can get some big willows, Pacific willow, 30, 40 feet, water birch, things like that can have a little bit of structure, but they just don't have the sheer volume of seed and the potential to put out thousands of seedlings that then become tens of really large trees on that floodplain over the course of a century. Yes, ma'am.
We did studies in relation to beaver populations and cottonwoods, and what have you?
So I actually, I'm a Utah State University Aggie. Brian Maloney is as well. They used to have a really good football program. We won't go into it. It's kind of gone the way of the cottonwood on the Columbia. But generally speaking, cottonwood and aspen are really great substrate for building beaver dams. And so if you go to places like the Tillicum Creek area in the Mad River, there's a confluence project that beaver have actually gone in, and they did this restoration with 2 constructed side channels, one out of Tillicum Creek, one out of the Mad. I think there were actually 3 channels, but the beaver made them effectively 1 because they had abundant cottonwood and aspen. When I was in Utah, what we did was we basically mapped the entire state looking at vegetation to see what the potential for beaver dams was based on the riparian forest type. And it turns out that we scaled that. So we modeled it and then we monitored it. And when you have cottonwood and you have aspen, more so aspen because they regenerate and they sprout out and layer. Cottonwood, it's like 1 seed, 1 tree. But that's basically the special sauce to have really big pieces of wood in a beaver dam in really small streams in places like the Intermountain. So that's why it's a foundation species. It feeds back not just on the main stem rivers, but also in the little creeks, the little streams that beaver can then impound and create that diversity of habitats in. John, please.
In addition to beavers, I was curious what insects, birds, mammals you associate most closely with cottonwoods.
Will flycatcher is something really ubiquitous with cottonwoods across the West. You'll find ones anywhere you want cottonwood.
From California up to here, Arizona, willow flycatcher is definitely the one that I think of in the desert Southwest. Stephen, do you have any associates with
I guess
Montana in the Northwest, I guess?
Yeah, I feel like all the nesting, a lot of nesting birds. I actually learned tonight, I thought there were softwoods because the wood is so rotten, but apparently they're hardwoods. It seems like the bear photo, it seems like a lot of like woodpeckers and things will either be foraging or maybe doing nesting cavities, and then I think that then allows other rot to happen in situations like that. Yeah, anyway, so I can't say specific species, but it seems like they're kind of one of these like keystone species for other species where, yeah, anyone that's looking for dead wood, bugs, or cavities, it's like, yeah, you can't find a better tree than that.
I would not have said this like 2 years ago, but after doing that Sanpoil project, and I don't think Zach DeLuca is here this evening, but he and I were basically walking through thickets of thorny vegetation that, this is post the burn, so like there's an understory, it's head high, and it's like hawthorn and rose, and it's just about as miserable as you can think. All those burned trees that fell over, they were like highways with cougar tracks and bear tracks on them, where they were just boogieing through this floodplain above all the stuff that's no fun to walk through. And then, lo and behold, you get to the end of one, and the bear basically made breakfast there like the day before looking for grubs and things. So I now associate black bear as well. Any birders have any other affinities or any observations?
Not a birder. There are many fungi that are specifically associated with cottonwoods. So
you should talk to this guy.
The aniseed fungal cap is on the top. It's like a bluish turquoise color. The gills do that at first, but they turn sort of tan, but they smell exactly like black licorice. That grows all under cottonwoods. And the only place I've seen Amanita muscaria on this side of the mountains, that like fly agaric, the red mushroom with the white spots, is under cottonwoods. It's like all over Sunny Slope. Yeah. It's really cool. There's a lot that are like associated directly with this habitat.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. There you go. And there are more. I personally don't know all of them off the top of my head. I mean, we're talking about 5 species at a continental scale. It varies widely. But because they provide that only vertical structure, I mean, they have all kinds of things that use them at various parts of their life cycle or their migrations. And that's what makes them a keystone species or a foundation species, depending on how you want to call it. Pretty special stuff. And now we're just about done. I will close out with a question for the gentleman who took this photo. So Stephen, tell us how you got this shot.
Yeah, so this is in western Montana, also on the North Fork of the Platte River. And it was that cavity I'd seen for years driving past it, and would always keep an eye on it, just thinking that's like something's going to use it one day. And one spring I saw a black bear sticking its head out of it. And so I'd just come back every few days and photograph. And I thought it was just the mom, so she would come out and like sun herself on the branches. And it took like a while. I was like, I think back at home, looked at my computer and then noticed like, oh my gosh, there's cubs. And kind of cool things that will be relevant here, possibly in the Cascades, is so Montana is very common for black bears to use cottonwoods. Like all the bear biologist people I work with, that's like, oh yeah, black bears are always in cottonwoods. It's kind of unique to that area because we have grizzly bears there. So you don't see a lot of black bears denning down ground level. So it would be interesting to see what happens here where, black bears can just use like ground cover, caves, things like that. And I would anticipate that there will be a behavior change if grizzly bears, get a good run at it.
Yeah, that's a great observation. Thank you, Stephen. That's awesome. Let's give it up for Stephen's photos. And I will just say that this has been a pleasure to be here this evening. Please, if you're not involved with the Wenatchee River Institute, please talk to Josh or please talk to Dee or Canucci. If you're involved with the Washington Native Plant Society, thank you so much for being a part of that. Please continue. If you're not, we'd love to have you on board. And then lastly, y'all who maybe play in the world of the Clean Water Act, the Society of Wetland Scientists has lots of policy briefs that kind of keep up with the Supreme Court. And so you may see us in DC as well as just sort of tracking what's going on as the political climate changes rapidly around water quality, wetlands, and floodplains. So get involved, stay involved, and thanks for being here tonight.